When you're designing a game, sometimes flaws in the core rules will just sneak up on you, and it can take a lot of playtesting to figure out that something's wrong. Other times though, the problems are so big and obvious you're going to wonder how on earth you could have possibly missed them before they smack you upside the head during early playtests. Even before the first test game, I suspected I was making seals do a bit too much in this game. They were reducing hand size, reducing the defenses of the opponent's Eldritch Lord, they were revealing opposing reverses, and they were also, to top it all off, integrated into the resource system. The first test game confirmed that this was basically even worse than I'd been expecting. Reverses couldn't be played on their own, and fronts without reverses were incredibly vulnerable to attack, so you needed to draw a balance of fronts and reverses, while also drawing enough seals to reliably keep pace with the opponent, both reducing their power and pushing you closer to victory, and also building your own resources so your game engine could function properly. Although this hadn't been the intention, I had basically ended up creating Magic's land problem, except somehow even worse. Spelling this out here might make it seem painfully obvious, but seals were never intended to be a riff on the land mechanic. They were actually intended to be more of a riff on climaxes from Wise Schwartz. Each player would have exactly 8 of them in their deck, and they would provide a somewhat random development over the course of gameplay. Since playing out fronts and reverses didn't require resources, the amount of damage missing early resource development would be actually somewhat minimal in this system, and a generous card economy would keep the game flowing in either case. That had been the theory. The reality was that having seals do so many different things for your game plan while being shuffled into your main deck was a complete disaster, and it was immediately obvious that things needed to change. The most obvious first step was to quickly move seals out of the main deck. The intended pace of the game is to progress through an early phase of building resources with fronts to a later phase where players would focus on attacking with reverses, and seals were actually doing a solid job of steering the game into that pattern, at least when they were functioning properly, so I didn't want to just jettison the concept entirely. However, there was absolutely no reason to throw them into the main deck, especially when players were already trying to balance ratios of fronts and reverses. At this point, the resource system was also fairly open to change, and I was considering several alternatives on the go. The first system I came up with generated consumable resources when seals were put into play, 1 resource per seal already in play. These resources would be tracked by a couple dice, and while you could carry resources over from one turn to another, once they were used, they were gone. These were not resources that untapped each turn. This ended up being one of the last systems I added to the game, and it was something of an afterthought, and that somewhat showed in how well it played. I knew that the game did need some kind of resource system to help with balancing card effects, but the game already had a lot of different things going on. That's ultimately why I ended up stapling the resource system onto a mechanic that was already a part of the game, in this case, seals. The resource system was meant to be inobtrusive. It was not meant to take up very much space in the player's deck, it was meant to take up very little space on the field of play, and it was also meant to take up very little place in the player's head as they were playing the game. A simple number that could be tracked by 1 or 2 dice was nice and out of the way, but it was still a fully functioning resource system, which helped balance out card effects and unlocked a ton of additional design space. Another of the alternatives I was considering was a renewable system that let you simply tap your seals for mana, but it wasn't actually working out all that well. For one, a large component of Black's color identity was building up resources over the game, and it's much easier to give out additional resources in a consumable system than in a renewable system like lands. Since in that kind of a system, each new land is going to untap every turn, giving you recurring resources every turn for the rest of the game. Each new land in that sort of a system is much more impactful. More importantly though, in this game, you were only really using your resources to activate abilities. There were no resource costs for playing out cards from your hand. Because of this, the game actually needed a much smaller level of resources overall, which ended up being a much better fit for a consumable system, so I ended up settling on that. The only real change was that I did make it slightly more dynamic. You would start the game with 3 seals face down, and each turn you could reveal one by tapping at least 1 front. And you would gain 1 mana per front you tapped to unlock that seal. So you only needed 1 front to unlock the seal, but you gained additional resources for having more of them in play. Further, I limited the field down to only 3 units at a time placed in front of your 3 seals. Not only did this impose a solid limit on the number of resources that could be generated each turn, but they also conveniently lined up your units with your seals, allowing the seals to be used as color limiters for the game's faction system. This implementation also did quite a lot to reinforce the role of fronts in the game. They were opening up seals and building up resources. The design of fronts did have to shift towards more on-play effects rather than tab effects, but that was a simplification that ended up working better anyways. Although there ended up being a lot more changes made to the game down the road, this resource implementation did its job well enough that it saw very few changes right up until I finally jettisoned sealed cards entirely, for a completely different reason. The system was inobtrusive, but in addition to taking up relatively little space on the board, this new implementation was also very reliable. There wasn't a whole lot of randomness going on there, which really helped it from taking up too much mental space when players were thinking about the game. It was able to do its job and stay out of the way. It does really speak to the importance of a resource system that even this simple, inobtrusive system still opened up a ton of design options for the game. So if you're designing a game and looking at your resource system, best of luck as you try and design it as optimally as possible, and good luck avoiding any major obvious problems as you do so. Have a fantastic day.